Well, good morning. Today is Halloween, and I don't usually do Halloween. I don't get into costume. We don't have Halloween parties. It's actually one of the holidays that I don't really enjoy all that much. I think it's because, first of all, I'm embarrassed to get into costume, and secondly, because with 5 kids, the problem of what to do with mountains of candy was always a difficulty. So I don't do Halloween. But I wanted to do something Halloween-ish, so I decided I would talk about death, because I've had some experience with death. More specifically, I want to talk about the afterlife, and then I'm going to end this with a ghost. Probably a real ghost, but is it? I don't know. You'll have to decide for yourself. I lost my sister when she was 24 years old and I was 28. It was in 1971. And people always talk about what a traumatic loss that must have been for me, and it wasn't, because we were never really close. I mean, it was as traumatic as it was for anybody else, but it wasn't really a big traumatic loss. And I lost grandparents and that sort of thing, but I never really had a serious loss until 1986, when my best friend died. My best friend's name was Gilbert Russick, and he was the musical director for the Lamplighters, which is a musical theater company in San Francisco. People who read my journal, or have been reading my journal for a while, know this story, and know this story for a long time. And Gilbert's death, I took Gilbert's death very hard. I said that I felt like the bottom had dropped out of my world. And the whole year after he died, I spent a lot of time reading about grief and death and everything else, and I learned a lot, which helped me help the family several years later when our first son died. But after Gilbert died, I had 3 different experiences where I'm fairly certain that I had contact with Gilbert. I had a dream about him. He was a very unhappy person, and I felt I could accept his death better if I knew that he was happy and that there was something beyond that and he was finally happy. And I can remember having a dream where it was kind of like the closing scenes of the movie Ghost, where Patrick Swayze at the very end is going off into the great beyond, and he turns and he looks at Demi Moore, and he's sort of surrounded in this light, and he smiles at her, this kind of beatific smile, and then he's gone. And in this dream, Gilbert looked like that. Now, I don't remember whether I had seen the movie yet or not, but he had that look on his face, and the thing that made me believe that there was some connection between that dream and Gilbert was that when I woke up, I had this completely overwhelming sense of peace, the first I'd had since he died. I had 2 other dreams later on, and in each dream, he was a little bit farther away from me. It wasn't the first dream. He was looking at me and he was smiling at me. I don't remember exactly what the second dream was, but in the third one, it was like a cloud, and I couldn't see him, but I knew that he was there, and he was saying to me, "You don't really need me anymore, do you?" And then that was the last dream I had about him. But the very first time that I experienced Gilbert's presence after he died, I was riding in a car home from my mother's, in this long stretch of dark road, and I was very upset because I was still very upset about his death, and all of a sudden I knew he was in the car. I don't know how I knew, I don't know how I sensed it, but there was such a strong sense of his presence that I felt that I could have reached out and touched him. I knew when he came and I knew when he left, and it was the weirdest thing I'd ever experienced. And a couple of years later, actually 10 years later, after our son David died, a patient in the hospital that I was managing brought some books in to help the staff cope with the loss of my son, or to help me cope with it, I don't know. And one of them was a book called Hello from Heaven. Worst book ever written. Do not go buy this book. It was just a horribly written book. But I read most of it, and the reason I read it was because the very first chapter, it's a book about how people from the afterlife come and manifest themselves to you, which sounds a little hokey, and I did think it was a little hokey, but in the very first chapter, it talked about one of the most common ways that people experience someone who has died is when they are driving alone on a dark road at night, and suddenly they know that that person is there. Now, I had never talked to anybody about that experience of Gilbert in the car before, and so I was so taken with exactly how perfectly this chapter describes what I had felt. I had never heard that. I had never heard anybody else say that before either. But the most, I think the strongest sense of Gilbert that I ever had was he had been a very private person, and his family, he had sort of a rift from his family. They kind of talked together, but he was gay, and they didn't really approve of him. And so when he died, since he had no immediate survivors, everything went to his niece and his nephew, and his sister and brother-in-law came out. They were in Oklahoma. They came out from California to help deal with it. Well, they didn't want most of his stuff. They took anything of value, and the rest of it they just left. And there were a lot of things that I knew were of value to him, and they were all going to go up for an estate sale. So the guy who was arranging the estate sale knew that I was hoping to do something. I don't know what, but anyway, he said he would sell the whole thing to me for $1,000. So I didn't have $1,000, and I didn't really have any place to put all of this stuff, but I borrowed the money from my mother, and what I did was I took as much as I could and divided it up among the people that I knew were his friends, and the rest of it I brought here, which is one of the reasons why I'm so furniture heavy in this house. But I felt it was the last thing I could do for him. I could clean up his house, I could take care of the things that he really cared about, and Walt wasn't able to go down to the city with me the day that we were packing up his house. So a couple of his friends came over, and we all got everything into we had a van at that time. We packed everything into the van. And I was getting ready to leave, and this woman said to me, "Are you going to be okay?" Because she was afraid that I would fall apart when I got into the car to drive home. And I said, no, that's all right, I'll be okay. And I got into the car, and as I sat there, I've never experienced this since. It was like somebody was standing over me and was pouring hot air, warm air, not hot air. And it started at the top of my head, and it just kind of slowly went all the way down my body to my feet. And when it got to my feet, I felt this amazing sense of warmth, and I knew that I had done the right thing, and that somehow Gilbert knew that I had done it. Now, you know, there are people who may say that this is all wishful thinking. I don't know, but everything was so right for my relationship with Gilbert, and I believe it. Whether it was actually him or not, I believe it. When all during that year after he died, I kept wondering why, as people do when they lose somebody, because he died unexpectedly. And it wasn't until 10 years later that I found out why. And the reason why was when my son died, and I had been down this road before. I hadn't lost a child before, but I knew what the path of grief was. And during my readings after Gilbert's death, I read something by Dylan Thomas, who said, "After the first death, there is no other." And I didn't really understand that until David died. And what my interpretation of it is that once you've gone through the grief process for the first time, when it happens again, you know that you can do it. You know that that it'll be horrible, you have to go through it, but you know that you'll survive it, and you don't know that the first time. Walt was a little worried that I would be upset if I didn't have any communication with the kids after they died. David died in 1996 when he was 24, and Paul died in 1999 at 30. And I never was upset that I had no sense of any kind of connection with him after they died, because I felt that when Gilbert died, there were a lot of unanswered questions. There was a lot of loose ends, and I think that my year of grief after he died tied up those loose ends. And I felt that the kids, even though they died young, nothing was left unsaid, and that was an important thing, because I always wanted to make sure that I always told them that I loved them, And so I didn't really feel the same kind of a need to connect with him that I did with Gilbert. Now the ghost. Paul died very suddenly. The circumstances of his death are bizarre and they're too long to go into in the video, so I won't. But there was a lot of turmoil surrounding his death. And we had a memorial service, of course, and everybody in town came. He was sort of well known in town. It was front page news when he died. And after the memorial service, his friends had a party. Now, they had a Polaroid camera to take pictures at the party. This is a Polaroid camera they had been using for many years to take pictures of the band. And it had worked perfectly for several years. Every picture had come out just fine, the way Polaroid cameras are. Using the camera after the party, all the pictures have come out just fine. But the pictures that were taken during the party have this figure in them. And, you know, is it Paul attending the party? Is there a ghost? Who knows? I'm going to show them to you, and you can decide for yourself whether this is Paul attending his memorial service or whether this is just a bad roll of film. I like to kind of believe that Paul was there because I think it was nice for him to have one last party.